You're welcome back to week 4 of this course. What we're going to do this evening is we're going to start again with meditation, and then we're going to do some review of the practice that we've done over the last week in our home groups. We'll have a 10-minute break as normal, and we're going to look at the theme for this week, which is the mind. Yeah, so mindfulness of the mind, of what we'll come to know as chitta. So I'll talk more about that later. And then we'll finish by setting up our home practice for the week. So with the meditation, what we're going to do this week is we're going to start investigating our breathing a little bit more in depth. But I just want to say something before that. So again, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but the word mindfulness, I think because of the word itself, we can sometimes get slightly the wrong end of the stick. Because it's got the word mind in it, we often think mind means something like brain, and the brain is where we think. So the mind has got something to do with thinking. So therefore, mindfulness is something about thinking. It's something about thinking about things. But that's not really the case. So you can experience something without thinking about it. You can observe something, you can be with something even without having to think about it. So, for example, you can, like today, I was just outside walking along the canal, and I could feel the sun on my body, which was lovely. But I didn't have to think about that in order to have that experience, in order to enjoy that experience. I could just experience it and enjoy it directly. So when we're being mindful, we're not thinking about what we're paying attention to. We're experiencing it directly. So I think that's quite important that we appreciate that the mindfulness is about experiencing things directly. As the poet Wallace Stevens has it, it's not an idea about the thing, but the thing itself. So not an idea about the thing, but the thing itself. So this afternoon, this evening even, we're going to be paying attention to our breathing. We're going to be with our breathing, we're going to notice it, we're going to feel it from inside our body. And what we did last week is we looked at that little video which demonstrated how there's actually more going on by way of movement in the body than we genuinely suppose. And when we start tuning into the movement of our breathing, we also begin to tune into the rhythm of our breathing. So this is kind of obvious, we know this, but what we're going to be doing is experiencing this experientially, the way that our breath has a rhythm. So there's the in-breath and the out-breath, and that's got its own kind of natural rhythm. And we're going to be tuning into that rhythm by starting with the movement of our breathing and then tuning into the rhythm of our breathing. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a little bit of counting. So we're just going to place a count at the end of the out-breath. So what this does is it helps us develop a continuity of awareness from breath to breath, from moment to moment. It gives us a little bit more just to kind of hang on to, as it were. And it creates, like I say, a kind of continuity of awareness. Because it's not just awareness of what's going on in the moment that we're interested in. It's a continuity of awareness where we pay attention to the same thing from moment to moment, and that attention, because it's continuous, it deepens. Yeah, so I think that's quite an important aspect of the practice. It's not just awareness in the moment, it's an ongoing, continuous awareness that deepens. In other words, the concentration deepens, so we're more absorbed in what it is that we're meditating on. So that's what we're trying to cultivate. So I suppose in a way you could say the mindfulness, when it's practiced really deeply, means that everything we do fully. That's why the course is called Life with Full Attention. It suggests a life that's lived wholeheartedly and fully and completely, so that every activity that we're engaged in, we're doing with the whole of ourselves. And the meditation really helps with that. It really helps us to cultivate that. So in the practice, what we'll do is we'll first of all just become aware of our body. And then we'll, in a way, feel our way into our breathing through a more general sense of our body. And then we'll begin to pay attention to our breathing, what's going on in our body as we breathe, the rhythm of our breathing. And then we'll place a count at the end of the out breath. So it'll be something like this. We'll breathe in and out in your natural rhythm, and then we'll just say 1 to ourselves. Breathe in and breathe out. Say 2. Breathe in and breathe out. Say 3. Breathe in and breathe out. Say 4. So you keep counting like that until you've counted 10 whole cycles of breath, and then you just start again on 1. So if you notice that you've lost count, it means that you've gotten distracted. That's one of the other advantages of the counting, is it's very, very clear to you, clear to when you've lost count that you've got distracted. It's kind of, in a way, kind of like immediate feedback. So when that happens, just notice where you've gone. Yeah, so just notice where your mind has gone, and then just come back to your body breathing and start the counting again. Yeah, so just sort of, in a way, notice what's happened. Notice where your mind has gone to. You might notice that it's gone to something that it's gone to before. Yeah, so in a way, this is what happens when we try and practice mindfulness. We start discovering what our mind is doing. Yeah, so that's a kind of a bit of a focus for the practice this week. So I'll just let you set yourselves up in the way that you like to meditate, and then we'll start in a minute or two. So just letting yourself settle into where you are. So beginning by settling into where you are physically. So just having a sense of your surroundings, having a sense of being in a particular place, of being somewhere. So there's different elements of that sense of place. One of them is temperature, the coolness or the warmth of the air in the place where we are. There'll be sound. So at this stage, we're simply tuning into the fact of sound. There's also the experience of space, of our body and our awareness being somewhere in relation to other objects and other things and maybe other people. And there's this strange fact of human consciousness that we can decide to direct it. So rather than it just being random, we can direct our attention, we can direct our awareness to different aspects of our experience. So we can pay attention to our body. So now just getting an overall sense of our body. So how does our body feel overall? Do we feel bright, well rested? Do we feel dull and tired? Do we feel ill? Do we feel well? We're getting an overall sense of the Vedana of our total experience of our body. Is there well-being or lack of well-being? And then being a little bit more specific. So first of all, paying attention to the face. Notice the way that when you attend to a particular part of your body, it changes your sense of that part of the body. It might bring a sense of ease, a sense of release if there's tension. So aware of the forehead, allowing it spread, the eyes, allowing them rest back in their sockets, the jaw soft. So paying particular attention to where the jaw joins the skull, which is around the ears. So we can grip and hold with the jaw. Giving a sense of the scalp, the whole of the skull. The neck, shoulders and the arms. So again, seeing if you can feel those parts of your body directly. From within those parts of the body. And the chest, the armpits, the upper back. The middle part of the trunk. Skin, bones, the ribs, the spine, the internal organs within. The abdomen, the waist, the lower back. The pelvis and the buttocks. And in that lower part of our body, we actually feel our body in contact with what we're sitting on. So we feel the mass of our body, the weight of our body, resting on the floor, or in our chair, and our cushions, and the feet, and the legs, and the buttocks. And tuning into the area in the abdomen. Maybe we can feel our belly pressing against our belt or our waistband. And notice movement. So how does our body move as we breathe in that lower part of the trunk? So we're not kind of pushing or willing or forcing. It's more that we're trying to engender an attitude of curiosity. So what is it? Like, what is your breathing? Like in terms of experience, what is it? What's going on in your body? What's going on in your abdomen and in the middle part of your trunk around the base of your rib cage? What movement is taking place? What about in the lungs, the ribs, the collarbones and the shoulders? In the neck and the throat? In the skull? We're just letting your mind rest on your breathing, wherever it's most interesting and most apparent. And now tuning into its rhythm. And notice the way that it just happens without you willing it. Your breathing just happens. You don't need to make it happen. It just happens of its own accord, as it were. Noticing the feeling of the in-breath and the feeling of the out-breath. Particularly noticing that with the out-breath, there's a sense of letting go, a sense of release. Tuning into that might help you if you feel tense or anxious. And noticing that little gap at the end of the out-breath. There's a little moment where nothing happens. And we're simply going to drop an account at that point. So we breathe in and out in our natural rhythm. And at the end of the out breath, we say 1. And then in and out in our natural rhythm, 2. In and out, 3. So we continue counting breaths in that way until we reach 10 breaths. And then we just go back to 1 again. And if you've become aware that you're no longer paying attention to your breathing, and you don't know what number you're up to, just make a mental note, well, where have you gone? Where has your attention gone? And then come back to your breathing and resume the counting at 1. So what's happening now? Are you still with your breathing? And if you aren't, where were you? Remembering that you don't need to make your breath happen. It just happens, it's natural. We're simply bringing a natural awareness to the natural breathing without trying to change it. So now just let go of the counting, just being with your breathing. And for the last period of the meditation, I'd invite you just to sit. So let go of trying to focus your attention anywhere and just sit. So bringing the meditation to a close. Okay, so there's a few really meaty questions. So thanks for those. So let's see what they are. So I thought, yeah, one person's just saying it'd be good just to have a bit of a refresher on what Vedana is. So Vedana, feeling tone, is one of these things that's quite, it's quite simple in a way, but quite difficult to get your head around. And I wonder if that's partly because we're in it. It's hard to see it. It's like that expression, you can't see the wood through the trees. So we are just deeply immersed in Vedana. It's what's known as an omnipresent mental event. In other words, it's something that's going on all the time. And because it's going on all the time, it's hard to spot it. So what I was basically saying last week, and this is the usual Buddhist exposition on Vedana is that it's of three kinds. So we have pleasant Vedana, which, to put it in more common parlance, is like the yum feeling. We have painful Vedana, which is yuck, and we have neither pleasant nor painful, which is, you know, whatever. So, so I just thought one way of just refreshing what our awareness of it is just by giving some examples. So just in the break, I was just thinking of an example from the day that I've had. So an example of painful Vedana was, I was working on my computer earlier today in my room, and the next door house is being completely renovated. In fact, the next two houses are being completely gutted and rebuilt. And so there's a lot of drilling and banging, and even today there was music. So that was painful. So it was painful to have someone banging on the other side of the wall while I was trying to work. That was a painful Vedana. And similarly, I got a nice compliment today. So I did an interview a couple of Fridays ago at the Buddhist Centre online, and somebody, I just heard from a second hand, as it were, that somebody had watched it and really enjoyed it. So that felt nice. That was a pleasant Vedana. I'm sure I had lots of neutral Vedanas, but neutral Vedanas being neutral Vedanas, I didn't notice them particularly. They didn't stand out for me. So I just wanted to give an example of how, you know, like with the drilling, it actually wasn't that bad. But if I was in a bad mental state, it'd be very easy for the drilling to become really annoying and for me to get quite annoyed about the drilling. Happily, that didn't happen today, but it could have. So you see how you can generate an unhelpful mental state out of an unpleasant Vedana. Similarly, with the compliment, it'd be quite easy for me to become a bit complacent, for example, if you know, and think that to forget that the reason the interview went well was because I prepared for it really well, and just think that it's something about me, which means that I'm amazing, if you see what I mean, and then make it into something that would be quite unhelpful. So that's why it's important to be aware of Vedana, because we can unconsciously react to it, basically. And when we do that, we can create unhelpful or painful experiences for ourselves. So there's a few examples. So it's one of the things that Maitreya Bandhu suggests in the book is trying to look at our lives in this kind of way in terms of Vedana. Now, the reason it's important is because we just recognize that Vedana is Vedana. It doesn't need to be a problem. It's just a fact of life. And if we know what it is, if we know what's happening as it's happening, we're less likely to react to it unconsciously. That's usually what happens. Part of the reason why I think it's hard to get our head around Vedana is we just don't realize that it's happening. And what we know is the story that we tell ourselves about what's happening. That's often what we do know about, and that's what we think. We confuse it. We confuse pleasant Vedana with the fact, we just associate pleasant Vedana with the fact that somebody loves us, and painful Vedana with the fact that we think somebody hates us, even if they don't. It's just something that they do is painful. So yes, you've got painful Vedana. Interesting, there's a question about negative Vedana. In a way, there's no such thing as negative Vedana. There's just painful Vedana and pleasant Vedana. It's not, in a way, it's not, it's sort of value neutral, as it were. Obviously, we prefer pleasant to painful, but it's what we do with it that becomes something that we can evaluate. And we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail next week, actually beginning to evaluate how our reactions and responses to Vedana can be helpful or unhelpful. So one of the questions that came up was in relation to negative Vedana. So the question is, if we practice regularly, sit with neutral or negative Vedana, does this not possibly have a negative effect on us, that we possibly become a pushover? So you might say, well, you know, someone's unkind to you, someone treats you poorly, and you just recognize that, well, this is just an unpleasant Vedana, and you just let them do that to you, as it were. So I don't think that's, you don't necessarily, I mean, that's really helpful to be able to do that, just to recognize that someone being unkind to you is just unpleasant. We don't need to add a whole lot of layers of injury and insult and indignation onto it. So actually, if you're really able to recognize that, you'll be in a stronger position to respond, because you won't necessarily get into a negative mental state about it. But you might, it might be quite wise at times just to point out to other people the effect that what they're doing is having on you. And again, if you start with that, if you start with just pointing out to somebody else the effect that their behavior is having on you, just in terms of the fact that it's painful, it's much more likely that they'll be able to hear that than if you start accusing them of various motives. So often we harm each other without really realizing what we're doing and not understand the effect that we're having on others. So again, coming back to just the raw Vedana experience will not just help us communicate, but will help other people to empathize with our situation and maybe modify their behavior in relation to us. So it's got a lot of quite important sort of ramifications in the way that we communicate this understanding of Vedana. I think there's a similar question, which is in terms of negative Vedana. So again, it's, in a way, it's not negative, it's just painful. We want to notice it and not react to it, but to instead let it pass over us. In many situations, I understand and can see how this will help give us freedom and create the gap. But is it always possible? There are times we need to stand up for ourselves, or we may be taken advantage of. Yeah, so it's always possible to create, in a way, I've already answered the question. So it might get to the point where we actually need to communicate, actually, this is not okay anymore. But again, if we're able to stay with Vedana, we'll be in a much better position. We're always much better. We'll always communicate much better when we've got that sort of presence of mind than if we're just in a purely reactive kind of state. So there's another question. How do we identify the negative subconscious Vedana, and how can we realize the reason for it? Is there any exercise to become conscious of the unconscious? So in a sense, it's a bit hard to know what you mean by subconscious here. Vedana just arises in relation to our senses, to what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch, what we feel with our body, and also the mind. So the mind has Vedana. So what we're doing in a way through developing awareness is making something that's unconscious conscious. So often we're unconsciously having Vedanas that's happening all the time. We just don't know that that's happening, and we react because there's no awareness. So precisely what we're trying to do is make those unconscious Vedanas conscious, so we know what's happening, and then there can be a little bit of a gap between the Vedana that we experience and the way that we respond to that Vedana. So that's it. So the answer is, how do we identify the negative subconscious Vedana? Is by trying to practice mindfulness. And that's precisely what we're cultivating in this course. It becomes easier and easier. Your awareness deepens and deepens as you practice. You've probably already noticed this even in the last few weeks, that you're just a little bit more attentive, you're a little bit more aware. And how can we realize the reason for it? That's a deeper question. So according to the Buddha's teaching, everything that arises in dependence upon conditions. The thing is, with Vedana, with our immediate experience, it's very, very difficult to see those conditions. In a way, the Buddhist focus is more to say, well, look, this is where we are right now. We can't necessarily change what's happened in the past, but what we can do is we can have some influence on how we set up conditions for the future. And that's the focus. The focus is, in a way, not how did we get here, but how do we get out of here? How do we free ourselves from these reactive patterns? So hopefully that, so in a way, the exercise to become conscious of the unconscious is mindfulness. And you could say, if you wanted to add something to that, an element of reflection. So and again, we'll look at that next week in a little bit more detail. A lot of Buddhist teaching is just trying to help us see this process, the way we create particular mental states and particular actions out of Vedana more and more deeply. It's trying to unpick that so we can begin to free ourselves. In the book, he mentions, that's Maitreya Bandhu presumably, that neutral Vedana can be due to a lack of awareness and our ability to live in the moment with full attention. I find this a very useful explanation. It is very easy to spend your time trying to avoid unpleasant feelings and to constantly search for pleasant ones. For me, this is really the basis of mindfulness, i.e. sitting with whatever there is, regardless of what that is. Well, yeah, that's what you're trying to do. But I think it's important, I mean, the point that you make there is often we're bored, and if we're able to stay with that, it'll open out to something richer. But we're not comfortable with boredom, and we usually look for something pleasurable instead, which keeps us on in a certain sort of superficial state of mind. Any suggestions for how or when to fit these practices into a busy day? Well, here's one thing. One thing we don't often like to think about is what we're going to let go of. So every time you do something new, every time you fit something new into your life, you have to let go of something because you just there's only a certain number of hours in the day. So I think it can be quite useful. That's one suggestion, is, well, what are you going to let go of? So, for example, I've been encouraging you to meditate every day. It's really, if you do one thing on this course, I would say try and meditate regularly. Meditate every day. Meditate ideally at the same time every day. That will be the thing that will have the most effect. The other things are also really good, the mindful walk and so on. But if I was to say one thing, meditation. So if you meditate for 20 minutes, you'll need to do something for 20 minutes less. So what is that going to be? So it can be helpful just to think in a way quite pragmatically about it, just in a way quite sort of soberly and matter-of-factly about it, because there are only so many hours in the day, and just getting less sleep is not necessarily the answer. The other thing is another suggestion for how to fit things in is to try and put the mindfulness practices that you're doing in relation to something that you already do. So, for example, leaving the house or coming into the house, or having a cup of tea. So it might be every time you have a cup of tea, while you're waiting for the kettle to boil, you sit down and do a breathing space. You might already have a tea routine. A lot of us do. We have our 11 o'clock cup of tea or our 2 o'clock in the afternoon cup of tea. So you're already going to do that. So in a way, try and do that mindfully. Try and you could, for example, if you're having a cup of tea, do your breathing space, and then try and drink your tea mindfully rather than reading the newspaper or scrolling down your Facebook feed. That's a couple of suggestions. And routine. Every time you do it, it strengthens the impulse and the habit of doing it. There's a few more questions coming in. A question in relation to mindful walking. Are we to remain aware of physical sensations in the body? How we are breathing during the walk, etc.? Basically, yeah. So you're trying to remain aware of the body. What you'll find is you'll notice that you're going off into thoughts. You're starting to think about, now that's chitta, that's what we're getting onto today. So you just try and let go of that and come back to the immediate experience of the body. Yeah. There's a lot going on in the body, way more than we realize. So in a way, you're just relaxing back into the body. Often what happens when we think, we often get tense, particularly if we start thinking about things that we're frightened of, that we're worried about, which might be to do with work or, illness, particularly at the moment, or the economy, or there's obviously a million things we can worry about. So we just come back to the body. Now, it might mean that we might need to think about things. There's nothing wrong inherently with thinking. Sometimes we need to sit down and think things through, but it's a matter of doing that really consciously and not just letting those thinking processes just run on indefinitely and undermine our well-being. I heard along the way at a talk that if the whole population meditated for 30 minutes per day, world peace would be achieved in one generation. Can you comment on this? Well, all I can say is that if everybody meditated for 30 minutes a day, it would make a massive difference to the world that we live in. That's one of the reasons that I bother to teach meditation. I really do think that that it's worth remembering. Like, there's 70 people on this course, and that's quite a few people. So if we keep just teaching people to meditate and people actually do the practice, it will change the way that our world is. People will be more sensitive to each other. People will be more considerate to each other. Whether world peace will be achieved is very difficult to say. I mean, I don't know how anybody could assert that with any confidence, because there's so many different factors that would be involved. And it's also worth pointing out that, while world peace is a really valuable thing, I mean, it'd be wonderful if people weren't going and killing each other in wars, that what the Dharma is aiming towards is freedom from the whole kind of conditioned world. So in a way, it's actually a deeper solution to the world's problems, as it were, than world peace, as noble and as worthy a thing as that is. Another question: if we practice, our Vedanas become more neutral. If we practice, our Vedanas become more neutral, do we lose a sense of a joyful experience being joyful experiences? So things don't become more neutral. Vedana actually becomes more intense in a way, the more you become aware. So that's one of the beauties of mindfulness practice, is that life becomes more vivid, it doesn't become less vivid. If I've understood your question right. And it's likely that if we pay attention to neutral Vedana, it'll actually start becoming pleasant or painful. Often, as I think Maitreya Bhante points out in the book, is neutral Vedana often arises because of lack of attention. It's just a sort of we're not quite clear. The 3-minute breathing space, I find, is difficult to stop believing thoughts that has around most of your life. But I find with your explanation of Vedana, I understand it's just an unpleasant feeling tone. By becoming aware, we can sit with like a painful tension in your body. So you're just trying to acknowledge the reality of what's going on. And weirdly, that makes a big difference. Being tangled up in your thoughts about something makes it more difficult to respond creatively. But if you're just aware, if you just know what's going on, even if it's very, very difficult, you'll be in a much better place. I think that's what the question means. I'm not 100% sure. So I just want to move on now to talking about the theme for tonight. Oops, I'm not sharing the wrong thing there. So if you remember, we're exploring at the beginning part of this course what are known as the 4 satipatthanas, the 4 applications of mindfulness. So 2 weeks ago, we looked at the body. So that's the basic foundation of mindfulness practice, being aware of the body and the movements of the body, knowing what we're doing with our body. And then on the basis of that, we can begin to develop a sensitivity to Vedana. We feel Vedana in the body, we have a broken heart. It's got a physical correlate, if you see what I mean. Like, we feel that broken heart, we feel that loss in our heart. So that's why it's so important to be aware of the body, because we'll become more sensitive to Vedana if we're aware of our body, because that's the kind of vessel within which we experience Vedana most of the time. Even Vedana to do with the mind sense arises in the body. So I've talked a little bit about Vedana, so I'll just leave it there for now. And then there's chitta, or mind. And then there's, just for the sake of completeness, I'll talk more about chitta in a moment. There's Dharma perspectives, or perspectives from the Dharma, bringing the teachings to mind, which we'll look at next week, which is about, in a way, evaluating what we experience when we notice the body, when we notice Vedana, and when we notice chitta. So, I mean, it's worth pointing out, just to, in a way, go backwards just a moment, that in a way it's amazing that we're aware at all, that we can be aware. I was just reflecting on that earlier when we did the mindfulness of breathing. The fact that we can direct our attention to something and remain with it and deepen our concentration on it is an amazing aspect of human life and experience, the fact that we can do this. So it's worth just sort of celebrating that. So when we're developing mindfulness, we really are developing a uniquely human characteristic, where it's a bit like we're taking where evolution's got us to as a species and developing that, pushing on with that, and deepening that kind of growth that in a way begins with the sort of biological evolution that's led us to this point. So yeah, we should just, in a way, just try and see it in that kind of very broad perspective, and just, yeah, like I say, rejoice in the fact that we can be aware at all. So yeah, so we again, I mean, I'll use those terms chitta and mind interchangeably, but I wanted to say something about that word chitta because it means something richer than the way we usually use mind in English. So usually, and I mentioned this earlier, when we talk about mind, we're just talking about thinking. But chitta can equally be translated as heart. And sometimes if you read Buddhist texts, chitta, you know, the mindfulness of chitta is translated as mindfulness of the heart or the heart mind. So what you have there is something that's also includes emotion. It's not just thinking, it includes emotion. So you've actually got three aspects. So chitta's got three aspects. There's a thinking aspect. There's thoughts in our mind, thoughts about this, thoughts about that, thoughts that might arise in dependence upon a particular kind of Vedana. Then you've got emotion. So that sense of mood, that sense of a kind of particular flavour, you know, of love or irritation or resentment. We can also think of that as mood, the emotion of our mind, of our chitta. It's a bit like an atmosphere. It's a bit like a particular kind of weather. You know, is it like today was a lovely, bright, clear day? And sometimes that's how we are, aren't we? Our mood is bright and clear. Other times it's heavy and dark. And wet and cold. So in the same way, our mind can be heavy and dark and wet and cold. So our emotions are like the atmosphere that's permeating our experience. There's also a volitional aspect of mind, and volition is not, again, a word we use all that often. Volition means something like intention. It's as if our mind is moving, it's hungry, it's moving towards some things and away from other things. So it's got the sense of impulse, of intentionality to it. So yeah, so it's quite a rich thing when we start really noticing our mind. And that's what we're going to do this week in particular. We're going to start noticing our mind and what our mind's doing, yeah, what our mind is. And it's so subtle. It's so subtle, the mind. It's very difficult to get a hold of, which is why we start with cultivating mindfulness of the body and Vedana, and then we can begin to get a bit more of a sense of what our mind is. So everything we experience through the mind. This is really, really important to recognize, that our mind, in a way, determines the way that we experience the world. So that's again why it's useful to distinguish Vedana from chitta, from feeling tone from mind, because we can have the same feeling, but we can have different kinds of mind in relation to that feeling. And this is one of the really important things to notice, is that we can have exactly the same experience, you know, as it were, from the outside, but our internal experience of that can be really, really different. And that's one of the reasons why it's so useful to meditate and to practice these different practices, the mindful walk and so on, at the same time every day. Because if we do exactly the same walk at exactly the same time of the day, we'll have different experiences. And the reason for that is because our mind will be different on different days. We start seeing the changeable nature of our mind. and we start seeing how the way that our mind is determines the kind of experience that we have. I'll give an example. So I don't know if you've had this experience, but you might go away on holiday. So probably a lot of us would really love to go away on holiday to a sunny place right now. Hopefully it's not painful for me to mention that, but I think it's probably true. But I don't know if you've ever had the experience of going away on holiday to somewhere really nice and you get in a bad humor. So maybe you have an argument, you know, there's some drama with the person that you're with or the people that you're with, and you have a barney, you have an argument. You know, sometimes traveling can be quite stressful. And let's say somebody forgot to, like I did hear of one friend of mine, she went on holiday to Greece, and the member of the party who was booking the flights got it wrong, and they turned up at the airport a day late for their flight. So, you know, that sort of thing can happen on holidays. And so what you can have the experience of being somewhere really, really beautiful with nothing stressful to do. You know, you don't have to ring anybody or write any emails or do any work. And yet you can actually be quite unhappy. So externally, in a way, you should be happy. But because the mind is disturbed with resentment or anger, you're not happy. Weirdly, you can also have the opposite experience, which is doing something which on paper shouldn't be enjoyable, but actually quite enjoying it. So sometimes I find when I come back from a holiday and I get back into work, I really enjoy getting back into my work, even though, you know, work's supposed to be something unpleasant, if you see what I mean. I know it's not as simple as that, but the point I'm making is that it's the mind that determines what kind of experience we have much of the time. Just lost my cursor there for a second. So what we're going to do this week is try and understand our mind, know our mind a bit better, and even cultivate our mind. So really, that's what we're going to be doing from here on. And in a way, the whole course centers around this this satipatthana, the awareness of mind. Everything is because it's our mind that ultimately, like I say, just determines what happens. It determines, because it's got this volitional aspect. The quality of our mind determines how we behave, how we respond, how we create the conditions for what's next. And one of the reasons why our mind determines what happens next is because we're always interpreting it, what's happening. We don't just have our experience, we interpret it. It's as if we fit what happens into a broader sort of scheme of ideas about the world we live in. You know, for example, we often overemphasize unpleasant things and underemphasize unpleasant things, or vice versa. We pick up these kind of attitudes, these stories, these ways of thinking about the world, and often we just pick them up kind of from the ether. I remember when I was at school having a bit of a realization. I was in the class with friends when I was in Tikipung High School. Celia will know who that is. And we were just chatting about politics. And I remember hearing the different kids in the class talking about politics. And I remember realizing, these kids, they're just, in a way, repeating what their parents say. And then I realized that I was just repeating what my parents said. It was a bit like my political views. I just kind of imbibed them. I never really thought about them. I just kind of imbibed them. So part of being aware of our mind is just noticing what our particular narrative is about, you know, who we are and the world that we live in. And actually beginning to be aware of it, and it may be even evaluating it, but asking ourselves, is it true? So a lot of what chitta, a lot of the way we experience chitta, a lot of the way we experience mind is as a kind of narrative. It's as if we're kind of telling ourselves a story about our life and what's happening in our life and why things are happening. So often we can turn Vedana into a whole story, a whole state of being. And often this doesn't really help. help us. It's not that all of our narratives are incorrect, but often they are. Often we're not a very reliable narrator. And you know, part of the reason for that is usually the narrative is all about us, like we're the main character. Everything's happening around us, and life's just not like that. Life's more complex. So part of what we're trying to recognize is that our thoughts, the thoughts that arise in our mind, are not necessarily facts, but we take them to be fact. We take our interpretations of just being the way things really are. So this is one of the key kind of teachings of Buddhism, really, is to see that the way we think about the world is just the way we think about the world. It's not necessarily true just because we think it. It's not to say that it's necessarily untrue, but usually we don't even stop to evaluate. We just assume that the way we see things is the way things really are. And when that doesn't work, when our narrative is shown to be wrong, we get pissed off and upset, usually, which is unfortunate because we don't need to. So in a way, and again, we'll look at this more in the coming weeks, as we're trying to bring the way we think about the world more in line with the way the world actually really is. So really, in terms of working with the mind, in terms of working with this particular satipatthana, this particular focus, is we're trying to stay with direct experience rather than spiraling off into thoughts about experience. So again, in a way, it's just an extension of what we've been practicing already with Vedana. So just trying to stay with Vedana and not letting that spiral into thoughts about experience. You'll probably notice this most vividly if somebody does something that you find painful. Somebody that you live with might, I don't know, it could be something as simple as like just leaving a whole lot of dirty washing up in the sink. And you come home and you think, oh, you know, such and such has left the dowel from the sink again. And it can be something as subtle as that. That's something painful. That's, you know, that's inconveniencing for you. Then begins to turn into a story. Then you might say, well, they always do that. Yeah, and then they probably don't always do that. They sometimes do that. But you turn that into always, and then it turns into resentment. So just from experiencing something which is annoying and unpleasant, you end up developing a whole narrative which affects your mood, and then that affects the way you perceive everything else that happens in your life. So what we're trying to do is, again, just come back to the Vedana aspect of what's going on. And if you can't do that, you come back to the body. So it's always a good idea to come back to the body, whatever's going on, just coming back to what's going on in the body, how it feels in the body, just in a kindly, kind of patient way. It's really interesting just to notice when you get into a more heightened state of mind, particularly negative state of mind, you kind of lose connection with what's going on, particularly in the body. You can kind of panic and everything becomes much quicker. So basically what I'm saying is that successfully understanding and knowing and cultivating a mind is based on the awareness we have cultivated in the previous two stages of the satipatthanas. Firstly, mindfulness of the body and its movements, and mindfulness of Vedana. So basically, so this week, what I'm going to be encouraging you to do is just notice narratives. And just seeing if you can let go of them. Particularly notice if there's particularly sticky ones in a way that it's almost like there's well, sticky, but also kind of a thought patterns that kind of almost seem to have a vortex kind of effect. You get sucked into them. It's a bit like kind of a whirlpool, a boat going around the whirlpool. It kind of gets sucked under. So it's a little bit like that with your thoughts, just noticing that and just keeping on coming back to the immediate bodily experience in the Vedana. So we'll be doing that in the meditation. So again, I'll just share a screen here. So yeah, so you've got your meditation. So this week, if you focus on the mindfulness of breathing, and again, I'd encourage you to use the YouTube video and just play that. Daniel will send you the email tomorrow with the link to the video. Just play the meditation. You can just follow it. And yeah, the counting will help you stay with your breathing. Because often it's almost as if, I think with the counting, it gives that thinking aspect of our mind something to do, so it doesn't just fly off into narratives. So yeah, so that's so, and again, think about, well, how am I going to, like, I'll give you a couple of minutes in a moment just to think about your meditation practice. And if you weren't successful at meditating every day, try and figure out why, and try and make a definite decision to do it at a particular time, and try and reflect on yeah, what's getting in the way of you meditating every day. So again, this is the volitional aspect of the mind that we're bringing into play here. Part of volition means to make decisions, to have a strong intention. And I think sometimes what happens with mindfulness practice and Buddhist practice more generally is that we just don't stop to really think, and we don't stop to make a definite decision, and therefore the thing that we'd like to happen doesn't really ever end up happening because we haven't made a clear decision. So I'll just, there's a few other items for this week, but I just want to stop there and just give you a couple of minutes to reflect to yourself about how you're going to really meditate every day. You might like to give yourself a day off, maybe on the weekend if you don't feel like it. But really, part of what having a practice means is doing something even if you don't feel like doing it. And actually, often that's when you really make the most progress. So I'm just going to stop talking for a couple of minutes and just give you a chance to reflect on that yourself. Reflect on your own meditation practice. So you might even like to make a couple of notes in the book or on a piece of paper or in a journal if you've got one. So just another half a minute just to reflect. So if you've already decided, what you could do is to spend the rest of the time you have just actually imagining yourself meditating. Imagining all the things you need to do, how it's going to happen, what you're going to sit on, where you're going to sit, what's going to happen before you meditate, what's going to happen after. Okay, so that's the meditation. So the second thing is the breathing space. So that's what we looked at last week, having a breathing space 3 times a day. So again, just actually one little sort of point of detail. I sent round, or Daniel sent round a little video of Maitreya Bandhu, the author of the book, leading the breathing space. And it was slightly different. There's two basic, well, I'm sure there's numerous ways you can do a breathing space. So what he was doing was a slightly different way of doing it, where first you become aware, then you gather yourselves around your breathing, and then you kind of expand your awareness out again, which is slightly different from the way that we've been doing it, which is, first of all, you pay attention to the body, then to sounds, and then to your breathing. But don't worry about it too much. Just maybe try and do it the same way each time. So if you've been following the video, just keep doing that. I wanted to say that because I thought some of you might have found it understandably a little bit confusing. So that comes out of, if you read Maitreya Bandhu's other book, The Journey and the Guide, he describes the breathing space in a different way in that book. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that. So again, I'll just allow a couple of minutes now just to reflect on how you're going to practice the breathing space. And again, one of the things that will really help is trying to figure out how you're going to remember to do it. So how are you going to remember to do a breathing space? Once you remember, you probably won't have that much difficulty doing it, but the tricky bit will be remembering to do it. So what's going to be your trigger, as it were, your trigger to remind you? So again, I'll just allow a couple of minutes just to reflect on the breathing space and how you in your life are going to practice that this week. So again, if you've already decided, imagine yourself actually doing it in that particular moment. And then you're more likely to remember naturally, as it were, if you've actually gone through it in your mind, if you've imagined the thing happening. And then the third thing is the mindful walk. So yeah, this is already well established at this point in the course. So in the breathing space and the mindful walk, just focus on the body and letting go of narratives. Once you've noticed that the one's there, you can let go of it and come back to the body and come back to Vedana. I think I said this last week, but often when I walk home, I live 20 minutes away from the centre. I just try and practice this. I'm often full of all kinds of thoughts about what we've been talking about, the particular topic, and thoughts arising from that. And I just try and let that let that kind of settle. So when the thoughts arise, just allowing them arise, but don't get kind of carried away with them. So that thinking is just one strand of experience that continues on, and not attending to it in an unhelpful way, but in a conscious way. So yeah, so again, if you know, how might you strengthen your mindful walk this week? How might you develop it? Which might mean doing it. It might mean just refining it in some way. So you'll know yourself what your challenges are, So this is an opportunity just to have some time to reflect on them. And like I say, actually imagine, don't just make an intention, but imagine it happening in your mind. You don't have to visualize it per se, but just imagine what you're going to do. Someone's just asked, is setting an alarm 3 times a day for a breathing space too structured, robotic, or should it be more natural? You can do that. You can just set an alarm on your phone at a particular time, and you could just put, I know on my phone, probably most people's phones, you can actually call your alarm something. So you could just do that. Definitely, that would be a really good way of making sure that it happens. Is using the technology to help us be a bit more mindful. Yeah. It's a bit like a slightly more sophisticated version of tying a piece of string around your finger. So I wanted to introduce one other thing. Now, I'm aware on this course that there's a lot, and that might be enough for you. So this next thing is in the book. It's a kind of, I like to call it kind of an optional extra. So if you're really enjoying the course and you're finding it quite easy to do the meditation, the breathing space, and the mindful walk, and you want to do something in addition to that, the next thing is what's called a mindful moment. Really what this means is it's like a mindful daily activity. So again, it's something that you already do, but you're just going to try and do it more consciously and more mindfully. So if you already feel like you've got enough to be getting on with it, don't worry, seriously don't worry about this. But if you do want to do something in addition to what you're already doing, it's not an extra activity, it's just something that you already do, but doing it with awareness. So it's a good way of deepening your mindfulness practice. So yeah, what you're looking for is something that a simple daily activity, something you already do, something that's simple, usually something that's sort of physical, something that's reasonably brief, and something ideally that you do alone. So examples are showering, getting dressed, brushing your teeth, eating your cereal, and probably the best example I can think of for this at the moment is washing your hands. So I'm washing my hands way more than I ever did. I used to, always wash my hands at the appropriate times, but now, washing hands when I leave, when I leave a building, when I enter a building, it's what we're supposed to be doing. So I'm washing my hands a lot, and washing your hands is actually quite pleasurable. There's a lot of pleasant Vedana to be had, as long as the water's not cold. But there's a real opportunity to connect with your body and with Vedana, and it's something that we're going to be doing frequently. So it's a really good thing to try and just be mindful when you wash your hands. And then it becomes something intrinsically kind of beneficial, rather than just sort of a necessary thing that you have to get out of the way as quickly as possible in order to keep yourself well and other people well. So it's a bit like, I guess what I'm suggesting is making a virtue of necessity. And again, it's just a matter of just coming back to that, the physicality of that. And it can be a real relief to let go of what it is that you happen to be thinking about if you're in the middle of a problem or solving a problem or in the middle of a meeting or something. It's just coming back to the immediate sensations of the hands. So that's one example. It's the best example I can think of. But it might be, you might like to do just brushing your teeth. You might like to tie a piece of string around your toothbrush, for example, or eating your breakfast. So again, I'll just give you a couple of minutes to think about that, about what your mindful moment might be. Okay, so what we'll do now is we'll just, you've got your, your 4 things to practice this week. You've got your meditation, you've got the breathing space, you've got the mindful walk, and if you want to, you've got the mindful moment, also the mindful activity, daily activity. So what we'll do now is just finish by doing a 3-minute breathing space, or if you prefer, it's just basically like a short meditation. So don't worry too much about sitting in a special way, just sit the way you are. And first of all, just pay attention to your body. Particularly noticing the contact that your body is making with what you're sitting on. The feeling of your clothing against your skin, so around your legs, the waist, the belly, your shirt or t-shirt or jumper. Noticing the hands and the face. So you're aware of your body as the sense of touch. Noticing as well sound. So again, don't worry too much about what's producing the sound that you can hear, but just noticing the fact of it, the fact of sound. And then tuning into your breathing. So it's probably easiest just to tune into the way that your body moves, particularly in the abdomen. Gathering yourselves around that movement and also the rhythm of your breathing. And then just bringing the meditation, the short meditation to a conclusion. So yeah, so that's basically the evening. Just to remind you that we're doing everything at the DBC on a donation basis at the moment. So we really are relying completely on donations. So if you are enjoying the course, it would make a really big difference to the work that we're doing if you are able to give us a donation. So I just invite you to consider doing that. I've just put the link in the chat box. Other than that, if you've got more questions, if you've got other questions, do please stick around. I'll be here for another 10 or 15 minutes or so. And other than that, I'll look forward to seeing you next week. So we're looking at the chapter on bringing the teachings to mind. So looking at what we've become aware of in a particular kind of way, trying to evaluate and understand it more deeply by applying some of the teachings of the Buddha. So that'll be next week. So yeah, so look forward to seeing you then.